Good evening, everyone. This is Dave Morgan, and this is our next installment of Making Online Classes Interactive. I'm assuming at this point everyone's run the audio setup wizard to make sure that they can hear me properly, and that looks like you've all lowered your hands. So thank you for that. For a quick environment check, please manage distractions just to make sure that you're not interrupted during the lesson tonight. Hang a do not disturb sign if you need to on your door. Please silence, turn off your mobile phones, mobile devices. Manage any pets, children, and any stray dinosaurs that may be wandering around because they can be noisy. Let's do a quick quality check just to make sure everything's functioning properly. If you would, please raise your hands if you can see the word quality check at the top of the slide. Okay. And give me a green check if you can hear me. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. Thank you very much. And if you would check up in the upper right and see if there's a little red dot that says recording, and if so, would you please write the word or type the word recording into the chat box at the bottom. Okay, great. Thanks very much. Okay, so again, welcome to the session tonight. Also want to welcome any of our virtual listeners out there for the recorded session. The goals for the session tonight is that we want to be able to describe in the context of a community of inquiry the social presence, the cognitive presence, and the teaching presence, the three main elements of a community of inquiry. And by the end of it, participants should be able to demonstrate understanding through exercises, and then we'll do a quick assessment at the end of the class. So let's do a quick icebreaker here. If you would, I'll have you raise your hand when you're ready, and then when I call on you, you can provide me your name, give me your highest level of education, and then tell me what your opinion is of the most powerful presence in learning, either social, cognitive, or teaching. So if you all would just raise your hands, and then I'll call on you one at a time, and you can answer those questions. Okay, great. Thanks very much. You guys can all lower your hands. And hopefully we'll see what happens during the session here to determine what the most powerful presence in learning is, if there is one. Okay. So just a refresher from our last session, the asynchronous version, the community of inquiry is made up of social, cognitive, and teaching elements. Those are the big three, and we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on those this time and get a better understanding of them. So to start with, a social presence. This is creating an environment of critical discourse. The emphasis here is to distinguish social presence in an academic context from just an ordinary social interaction. So what is critical discourse? Critical discourse might be defined as open, honest discussion and/or debate towards a goal of greater understanding. What it is not is some kind of hyper-competitive or attempt to persuade other people emotionally. It's not that kind of debate when we talk about debate. Nor is it purely a social activity just for the sake of being social. The purpose is for each individual to frame learning objectives based on their own perspective in addition to the facts presented, and then this discourse should be aimed at furthering understanding for all members of the group. In order for it to be effective, it should be open, and that is all members should feel comfortable to participate and yet still be critical and engage in respectful debate. So how would you incorporate it into a course? It gets to be troublesome for the online community. How do you make it social? Some of the examples that are given are to use text. To use text in the chat format in discussion groups. Another example is to use actual video conferencing where we actually have webcams and we get to see and interact with each other in real time. And then another example that was given was to be able to use emoticons. Now I know we use emoticons a lot in text and social media, but it can actually be used to convey emotion and can help provide some inflection. So if you would, focusing on this little box right here. Sorry, I'll use my little pointer thing to help us. If you would go over to your emoticons over there on the far left and grab one and show me what I mean by using an emoticon. You can grab a smiley face. There you go. Thanks very much for demonstrating for me. So that's one way that we can use to actually to communicate in the online environment. So as a quick recap of what social presence is, I'm going to go ahead and set up a poll here, just a moment. All right, if you would, go ahead and use the polling to figure out which of those three is the best description of social presence. There you go, thanks very much. So let's see what the responses were. Hey, we're 3 for 3, so everybody agrees that social presence in the community of inquiry is best described as an environment in which everyone is comfortable to contribute in discussion. Great, thanks very much. Okay, the next is the cognitive presence, which is another way of saying making sense of our own experiences. Now, the cognitive presence is generally the individual side of this, and this is the practical inquiry model that John Dewey developed actually in 1933. But you'll notice that it roughly follows the scientific method, where there's some kind of a triggering event, which is a question or a problem that needs to be solved. And then the next step in that is the exploration phase, which is where we gather information, as much information and data as we can from our senses, from each other, from volumes of published materials, whatever. We gather all that information, and then next in the upper right there, you see we go to integration, which is where we try to connect all those dots and try to come up with some kind of a solution from all those different inputs. And then finally, in the resolution stage, we try to apply the solution to that problem or apply the answer to the question. So this is again, it roughly follows the scientific method, and it's the model of how typically how we learn. So what I'd like you to do now is I'm going to provide you verbal prompts, and if you would use the pointing tool, and you can see the example of the pointing tool there. It's pointing. It's on your toolbar. It's the second one down. If you click on that, you'll see a little flyout that gives you options. So I'm gonna call out one of the phases, and I want everybody to use their pointer to tell me which one is which one it applies to. So let's start with the triggering phase. Which one of these describes the triggering phase? Great, exactly right. That's the recognition of a problem. Which one of these describes the resolution phase? Resolution. Very good, applying the solution to the problem. Which one of these represents the integration phase? Integration. Very good, excellent. And then finally, the exploration phase. Excellent, you guys are pros. Okay, finally, the teaching presence. And the emphasis here is that it is a teaching presence. It's the teaching, not the teacher. In the community of inquiry model, there is a collaborative relationship whereby the students and teachers are both students and teachers. While there should always be someone in a leadership role at any given time to set direction and facilitate discourse, the responsibility can and should shift during the course of learning so that all the students can actually be teaching as well. Now, there is generally a teacher who ascertains the objectives and sets the curriculum, asks questions, facilitates discussions and debates, and just makes sure that the discussion stays on track and the focus is maintained. This quote from Dewey: "Thought needs careful and attentive educational direction." So to summarize, the role of educators should be in the teaching presence to design and organize, to facilitate, and to direct instruction. I'd go ahead and change the polling here, if you would. Is number 1 true or false? Okay. And the answer is false. Teaching presence does not mean a teacher should assert themselves as someone in authority. In this context, actually, it's number 2. Teaching presence actually means setting objectives, facilitating discourse, and ensuring learning stays on task. So in applying the 3 presences, raise your hand if you've got an example of how you would create these 3 presences in a classroom. If anybody's practical experience in the classroom, go ahead, Shaylin.
I think creating an environment where everyone is comfortable, so there's clear learned expectations for group participation, and so that people are not demeaning one another or saying negative comments.
Okay, and that would certainly speak to the social presence. How would you attend to the cognitive and the teaching presences in that same environment? Anybody else? Go ahead, Nancy.
For the cognitive presence, you're probably going to want to post your syllabus ahead of time with what needs to be included in the particular projects or the homework that you're going to have them working on. You want to have rubrics, the books, and the assignments. So once again, too, they can get all their reading and everything going on. And with the teaching presence, you're going to want to create really like a structured environment that is also going to set parameters for the social interactions, what's allowed, what isn't allowed. You want to set up activities, etc. So this way it's going to foster the cognitive while they work on whatever projects or the information that you're putting out there, but also with those activities you want to make them interactive, which is also going to help foster the social presence.
Excellent. Does anyone else have anything that they would add to that? Okay. Then let's just tie this up. The 3 elements of social, cognitive, and teaching presence all contribute to critical thinking and further understanding. Each element is important and should not be considered in isolation. So let's do a quick summative assessment, and let me get volunteers. What I want you to do is I want you to read that sentence, and then I want you to drag the image into the box that it represents. The top image is cognitive, the middle image is social, and the bottom image is teaching. So of those 3, or all of them, or any combination of those, the instructor lectures on the nature of existence and cites different philosophers' writings. So which of the 3, or any combination of those, drag them into the box if that applies. Okay? Anybody want to comment on the results there? I agree with that. Go ahead, Nancy.
I went ahead and I did the thinking man because it's essentially the meat of, I think it would be cognitive simply because this is the information that's being put out in the class.
Excellent. And I agree wholeheartedly that there's certainly the teacher is teaching, and that is going to call on the cognitive presence among the students. Very good. So let's try another scenario. The instructor asks students to read texts from various philosophers and then assigns them to do a reflection paper for them to provide their thoughts on the nature of existence. And then they'll turn that into him. Which of those does that include? Okay? Somebody tell me how the social presence is attended to there.
I selected that the instructor asked the students to read texts from various philosophers and write a reflection paper. So they may be working in a group to complete that assignment, so they would have to work together, value each other's opinions, and show respect for one another. So
Okay, so your assumption was that they would work in groups, and that's fine if that was the assumption you made. I kind of deliberately left that out. I made it like this was just an assignment, and the instructor was assigning that to everybody, and everybody was going to turn it in individually. So that's fine if you made the assumption that they're working in groups. And actually, that's funny. Well, our last slide is this, and I think you'll see here. The instructor asks a question about the nature of existence, and students discuss and disagree with each other, and they cite the different philosophers' writings. Any others? Are cognitive or teaching presences met here? And I see Nancy's post. You're absolutely right. It is open to interpretation. So certainly that's why if you make any assumptions on that, go ahead and tell me what those are. So go ahead and explain to me teaching and social, but not cognitive. Go ahead.
I pick social simply because you've got the students discussing and disagreeing with one another, because it says the instructor asked the question. So I'm assuming it's not like a writing or a reading that they've had to do. And therefore, you've got the students interacting and discussing and actually learning and building off of each other.
That's right. Shaylin?
And I did the instructor because the instructor had to be strategic about the question they asked, and also had to make sure that the students were working well together when they are getting along or so on.
Okay, very good. And Bruce?
Well, even though the instructor starts the process, I would say that it's the interaction among the students that leads to the decision-making process.
Okay, so, and thank you, that's exactly right. So none of you believe that their cognitive presence is here? Interesting, go ahead.
Well, actually, really, for all three examples that you gave, you could put in every single one of these, because the actual cognitive part about it is for them to be able to have this discussion. One, they would have had to read the philosophers' writings and hopefully understand them well enough to be able to go through and discuss and debate on these. Plus, by having the discussion and the disagreements about this, they are actually creating and scaffolding in potentially new knowledge and building upon their knowledge base by learning from others.
I agree. And just to wrap this up, I'll tell you where my head was at when I wrote this, and it is open to interpretation. For this one, I had, just as it showed, the instructor lectures. I see that as, I think cognitive has to happen in all of them, because at some point there are cognitive processes going on. But in this one, I only saw this as teaching. In this one, I saw this, again, only as teaching and cognitive, because the assumption was this was just an individual assignment and everybody did their reflection and then turned it in individually, and there wasn't any social interaction or discourse. And that this one would actually be the one with all three, because as Nancy pointed out, how they wouldn't be able to discuss and disagree if they didn't have the cognitive element there. So good discussion. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Are there any questions? Well, thanks very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple of weeks when we come back for the next session. Have a good night.